Imagine staring at a perfectly functional military helicopter. It's a literal masterpiece of modern engineering, and it's worth at least $10 million. Now, imagine casually walking up to it with your friends, grabbing the sides, and pushing it straight off an aircraft carrier into the ocean. Splash! Gone forever to the bottom of the sea. Why on earth would anyone do this? Were they completely crazy? Was it a massive mistake? No, it was a calculated, absolutely desperate decision. Welcome to the chaotic month of April in 1975. The Vietnam War is rapidly coming to an end, and the United States is officially orchestrating the largest helicopter evacuation in all of human history, a massive undertaking known as Operation Frequent Wind. But let me be clear, this wasn't a neat, orderly departure. It was a logistical nightmare of epic proportions, breaking every single military rule. To understand why high-tech helicopters suddenly became disposable ocean trash, we have to look at the sheer scale of the panic that unfolded. By late April, the North Vietnamese army had completely surrounded the city of Saigon. The entire capital was a high-stress pressure cooker just waiting to explode. For several weeks, the US military had been flying fixed-wing aircraft out of Tan Son Nhut Air Base, successfully taking out tens of thousands of people. These giant C-130 transport planes were essentially a reliable conveyor belt of salvation, moving evacuees out of the danger zone day and night without stopping. But on April 28, everything suddenly changed for the worse. The distant rumble of artillery fire quickly turned into a terrifying reality for the airfield. Heavy artillery shells began raining down directly on the runways of Tan Son Nhut. Massive explosions tore through the concrete, leaving huge, unnavigable craters everywhere. The giant C-130 transport planes could no longer land or take off safely. The primary, most efficient escape route for everyone was now completely destroyed. The trap was rapidly closing on Saigon. Tens of thousands of Americans and South Vietnamese allies were now stuck inside a city on the brink. It was time to push the emergency button. They had to switch to a plan so desperate, it would literally cost millions of dollars in sunken metal. With the airport completely useless, the US ambassador in Saigon was forced to make the ultimate choice. It was officially time to execute Option 4. Option 4 meant abandoning all fixed-wing aircraft and initiating an evacuation relying entirely on a fleet of helicopters. But how do you tell everyone? You couldn't just announce it on public television. To signal the start of this massive operation, the American Forces radio broadcasted a bizarrely specific code. Right after reading the temperature, the radio DJ played the song White Christmas by Bing Crosby. Yes, a Christmas carol in the middle of a tropical April. For the Americans and key allies listening closely, that snowy holiday song meant one terrifying thing: grab your bags and run to your assembly points immediately. Meanwhile, offshore, floating in the deep blue waters of the South China Sea, a massive armada was waiting. This was the legendary Task Force 76. Task Force 76 featured dozens of ships, including massive aircraft carriers like the USS Midway and the USS Hancock. They were the ultimate lifeline. The master plan was to send heavy-lift military helicopters, specifically the gigantic CH-53 Sea Stallions, from these ships directly into the heart of Saigon. These mechanical beasts would fly in, pick up hundreds of desperate evacuees from designated rooftops, and fly them safely back to the fleet. It sounds incredibly simple on paper, right? Just a perfectly choreographed aerial bridge moving back and forth like a well-oiled machine. But as the famous saying goes, no military plan ever survives first contact with reality, and Operation Frequent Wind was about to go completely off the rails. Almost immediately after White Christmas played, the carefully drawn map of secret assembly points completely failed. Word spread like wildfire across the panic-stricken city. Tens of thousands of terrified citizens flooded the streets, carrying whatever they could, desperately seeking any possible way out of the collapsing capital. They abandoned their cars, blocked the roads, and rushed toward the few remaining American facilities. The entire city's infrastructure essentially froze in gridlock. And the absolute epicenter of this overwhelming chaos, the United States Embassy, which was about to face a siege unlike anything it was designed for. The US Embassy was originally designed to be an impenetrable fortress against ground attacks. But it certainly wasn't designed to be a heliport for thousands of people. Outside, a massive, panicked crowd completely surrounded the compound. desperately pressing their collective weight against the unyielding concrete walls and iron gates. US Marines stationed at the perimeter had to physically hold the line, occasionally pulling select evacuees over the high walls one by one in a desperate struggle. Inside the compound, the situation was just as absurd. The official evacuation plan called for large military helicopters to land safely in the main courtyard. There was just one massive, wooden problem standing in the way. A giant, ancient tamarind tree was growing right smack in the middle of the landing zone. Helicopters and giant trees do not mix. If the spinning rotor blades clipped those branches, the aircraft would violently crash into the crowded compound, causing a catastrophe. In a sheer panic, professional diplomats and combat-hardened Marines suddenly had to become amateur lumberjacks on the fly. With zero preparation, using fire axes, rusty handsaws, and whatever sharp tools they could scrounge up, they furiously chopped at the massive trunk to clear the landing pad. It was a grueling race against time. With a loud, echoing crack, the giant tree finally fell, and they hurriedly dragged the heavy branches out of the way. Just in time. Meanwhile, high above the clouds, the first wave of CH-53 Sea Stallion helicopters approached the city from the offshore naval fleet. These machines were absolute beasts of the sky. Each one was technically capable of carrying over 50 fully equipped combat soldiers at a time. But when the pilots finally arrived over the embassy, they looked down and immediately realized the absolute nightmare they were about to drop their massive birds into. They had to descend a massive aircraft into a tiny, walled-in concrete box, carefully dodging radio towers, telephone wires, and the constant threat of sniper fire. To put it into perspective, flying this mission was exactly like trying to thread a tiny needle, while actively riding a roller coaster, blindfolded. It required nerves of absolute steel. And the most exhausting part, the pilots had to do it perfectly, over, and over, and over again throughout the entire day. The logistics of keeping this massive aerial bridge open were absolutely staggering. It was a constant race against both time and mechanics. A single flight from the naval fleet to Saigon and back took about 2 hours. Every minute wasted could cost lives. The helicopters burned through their fuel rapidly. They were flying at maximum capacity, draining their tanks faster than normal operations allowed. On the flight decks of the carriers, crews worked like madmen to quickly refuel, repair, and launch the birds back into the sky. Inside the embassy compound, terrified evacuees were being crammed into the helicopters like sardines. There was simply no time for order. And I mean literally packed. Normal weight limits and safety regulations were completely ignored. If there was a spare inch, someone filled it. Safety manuals were completely thrown out the window. The mechanics of flight were pushed to their absolute breaking point during this evacuation. The rule of the day was remarkably simple. If a helicopter could physically generate enough lift to hover off the ground, it flew. But the official US military helicopters running this bridge were actually only half the story. Another massive problem was brewing right next door. As the US was executing its organized, albeit chaotic, evacuation, the South Vietnamese military was simultaneously and completely collapsing under the pressure. South Vietnamese pilots quickly realized that if they stayed behind as the city fell, they and their families were absolutely doomed. So, they did what anyone with a basic survival instinct and the keys to a military helicopter would do in that situation. They grabbed their families, stole their own aircraft, and flew away from the burning city, taking off entirely rogue into the unknown sky. They flew out to sea, flying completely blind over the open ocean, desperately searching for the American fleet they knew was out there. And that, my friends, is exactly when the real, unprecedented traffic jam over the South China Sea truly started. Imagine you were an air traffic controller stationed on the USS Midway. Your only job is to manage the flow of dozens of giant US military helicopters. You are already operating at absolute maximum capacity. But suddenly, out of nowhere, your radar screen lights up like a chaotic Christmas tree. Scores of unidentified blips are heading straight for your ship. And these weren't the giant American Sea Stallions returning from the embassy. These were members of the South Vietnamese Air Force, or VNAF, flying stolen R-1 Hueys and massive, twin-rotor CH-47 Chinooks. They had absolutely no radio contact with the fleet. They had no official clearance to approach the airspace, let alone land. They just saw a big, flat, grey ship floating in the middle of the vast ocean and simply decided to drop right in. In a matter of minutes, the sky directly above Task Force 76 turned into a swirling, highly dangerous swarm of metal. It was exactly like trying to organize a chaotic beehive, except every single bee is a multi-ton flying machine with deadly spinning blades. These rogue helicopters were circling the ships aggressively, running dangerously low on fuel after their desperate, blind flight from the city. When a VNAF Huey finally managed to touch down on the crowded carrier deck, it was immediately swarmed by Navy sailors. The deck crews rushed to pull the terrified refugees out of the aircraft and usher them quickly to safety below the flight deck. But as soon as the people were out, the ship's commanders faced a massive, critical problem that threatened the entire operation. You see, the deck space on a military aircraft carrier is highly calculated geometry. Every single square inch matters for takeoffs and landings. And now, dozens of unwanted, empty South Vietnamese helicopters were completely clogging up the floating parking lot. The massive USCH-53S, carrying hundreds of evacuees from the embassy, were returning to the fleet, only to find absolutely no place to land. The situation was absolutely critical. The giant sea stallions were hovering in the air, rapidly running out of gas, carrying hundreds of exhausted people. Meanwhile, the remaining South Vietnamese pilots arriving at the fleet couldn't even find a tiny spot to touch down on any of the ships. Faced with empty fuel tanks and nowhere to park, they performed a survival maneuver so insane it truly belongs in a Hollywood action movie. First, they would fly their helicopters dangerously close to the side of the moving aircraft carriers, hovering just feet away from the metal hull, while trying to keep the massive machine steady in the heavy ocean winds. They would order their terrified families to jump out the door. Waiting sailors would catch the falling refugees midair, pulling them safely onto the deck while the helicopter blades chopped violently just inches away. But the pilot's job wasn't done yet. Now totally alone, he would pull the empty helicopter away from the ship and out over the open ocean. Hovering precariously above the crashing waves, the pilot would quickly strip off his heavy flight suit and helmet to prepare for the final act. With one swift motion, he would roll the entire helicopter sharply to the right side, forcing the massive spinning rotor blades toward the water. And in that split second, the pilot would leap out the left door, diving straight into the deep blue sea just before the crash. The abandoned helicopter would violently smash into the waves, instantly tearing itself apart into millions of dollars of sinking, twisted metal scrap. A small rescue boat would then race over to pluck the shivering, exhausted pilot from the water, saving another life against all odds. It was incredibly dangerous, but ditching in the drink was the only way to survive without completely destroying the crowded ships and everyone aboard. But even with brave pilots voluntarily crashing their own birds, the deck of the USS Midway was still catastrophically jammed with parked machines. And just when they thought the airspace couldn't possibly get any more complicated, a tiny little airplane suddenly appeared on the distant horizon. Through the chaotic swarm of massive military helicopters, a completely different type of aircraft was slowly making its way toward the crowded fleet. It was a small, two-seat Cessna 01 bird dog observation plane. It looked like a fragile tiny toy compared to the giant war machines. Inside was South Vietnamese Major Bueng Lai, and he wasn't flying alone. He had desperately brought his wife and their 5 children along with him. Yes, you heard that correctly. 7 human beings were physically crammed into a tiny airplane designed strictly for only 2 people. To make matters infinitely worse, Major Bueng Lai had absolutely no radio contact. He couldn't talk to the ship to ask for any help. Landing a plane on a short aircraft carrier normally requires a specialized tailhook to catch the thick arresting wires stretched across the deck. The Cessna didn't have one. Landing a light, hookless aircraft on a moving, windy carrier deck is basically a guaranteed death sentence. With his fuel running critically low, Major Bueng Lai boldly flew his tiny plane incredibly low over the jammed deck of the USS Midway. Hoping to communicate with the deck crew below, he quickly opened his side window and dropped a crumpled piece of paper down toward the ship. But the fierce ocean winds and the massive rotor wash from the helicopters instantly blew the lightweight paper away. Straight into the sea. He only had enough fuel for one more pass. He quickly wrote another note. But this time, he tied it to his heavy service pistol. He circled back around, flew over the carrier deck once more, and dropped the heavy package. It plummeted down and landed with a loud thud. A deck sailor immediately ran over, picked up the unusual, heavy package, and rushed the piece of paper up to the ship's bridge. The note was handed directly to the ship's commander, Captain Larry Chambers, who had been anxiously watching the tiny plane circle his ship. He carefully unfolded the paper, written in broken English. The desperate note begged, "Can you move these helicopters to the other side? Please rescue me." Captain Chambers looked at the handwritten note in silence. He looked up at the tiny family circling helplessly in the sky above his ship. And then, he looked down at his own flight deck, which was absolutely choked edge to edge with multi-million-dollar R-1 Huey helicopters. It was a literal million-dollar dilemma. Protect perfectly good military hardware, or let a desperate family of 7 run out of gas and crash. He made a decision that would define his entire career. He confidently grabbed the radio and ordered his men to immediately clear the landing deck. But the deck sailors were completely confused. Clear the deck? There was literally nowhere to park these giant machines. Every single inch was taken. When you run out of horizontal space on a ship floating in the ocean, there is literally only one direction left to go, over the edge. So, the sailors and flight deck crews rallied together. They grabbed the Hueys and, with a massive heave, pushed him to the very edge. With perfect coordination, they shoved perfectly good, highly expensive military hardware right off the side of the carrier, clearing the runway by force. Splash, splash, millions upon millions of American tax dollars sinking straight to the bottom of the deep blue sea to make room. Once the runway was finally cleared of the multi-million-dollar obstacles, Major Buing Lai lined up his tiny Cessna. The entire ship held its breath. Without a tailhook, and with the ocean winds howling, he slowly and precariously descended toward the moving metal deck of the USS Midway. He touched down hard, bounced once into the air, skidded violently down the runway, and miraculously came to a complete halt with room to spare. The entire crew erupted in massive, deafening cheers. They immediately rushed toward the tiny plane to welcome the terrified but safe family. In total, despite the chaos and the breaking of every rule, Operation Frequent Wind successfully evacuated over 7,000 people in just a matter of hours. It cost dozens of highly expensive helicopters, but in the end, pushed into the sea, those machines bought the most valuable thing of all, human lives.